Hope everyone's having a good day. We're ready to begin today's Torah portion, which is the second Torah portion of the entire Torah, and it's called Noach. And if you happen to be in the Blue Art Scroll Chumash, you will find it on page 30, but whichever Chumash you're in, it shouldn't be too difficult because it's the second Torah portion, the portion of Noach. So let's turn back actually one page to the last section of Bereshit, which is where we were introduced to this individual by the name of Noach. And if you look in chapter 5 of Bereshit, which is the last section of last week's Torah portion, verse 28 says the following, that there was a man by the name of Lamech, which was the father of Noach, and he lived 182 years, and he had a son, and he named his son Noach. Now, why does he name his son Noach? So the very next verse says, because he said, and our rabbis say he had prophetic vision to know this. He said this, and by the way, it's interesting that we say that the one area of prophecy that still remains in the world today is when it comes to naming our children. And that's why parents are given by divine inspiration the proper name for their child based on what that child's mission and purpose in the world is. So we're always told never to tell children what to name their baby, because God will tell them through divine inspiration what their child's name should be, the appropriate name. But Lamech, who was the father of Noach, he named his son Noach. Why? Because the word Noach, we're actually familiar with it earlier on in the Torah portion. It says that God made the world in 6 days. Vayanach, he rested on the seventh day. The word Noach means rest. So basically, Noach, this week's Torah portion, means rest. Why did he name his son Rest, Noach? Because he said, this one will bring us rest from our work and from the toil of our hands, from the ground which Hashem has cursed. Now, what does he mean, the ground that Hashem has cursed? And what does it mean that he's going to bring us comfort? What kind of comfort is he going to bring us? So here we find something very interesting. Rashi comes along and explains this to us. And Rashi says that up until the time of Noach, there was no such thing as a plow. People had to work the earth with their hands to take out the thorns and work with the, cut themselves and plant wheat. And that was one of the curses given to Adam after Adam and Eve ate from the tree of knowledge. By the sweat of your brow, you will eat bread. Why with the sweat of your brow? Because they physically had to sweat a lot more than we do today to earn a living, because they had to physically plow the earth. Lamech, the father of Noach, saw prophetically that Noach will bring us rest from the work of our hands. Why? Because he was the one who invented the plow, which relieved man of the toil of the hands. So going back to the Hebrew text, Ze Yenachmenu, he will bring us comfort, Mima'asenu, from our deeds, Ume Itzvon Yadenu, and from the toil of our hands, from the earth that God cursed. What's fascinating, even before we get to this week's Torah portion, is that the end of last week's Torah portion, after the birth of Noach, was that God says, I see that man's lifespan is causing man, the excessive lifespan, to engage in all sorts of sins, because you see already in the first Torah portion, people were worshiping idols, and obviously the murder of Cain murdering Abel. And so God says, I see that man's lifespan is too long. To quote the verse 3 of chapter 6, God says, my spirit shall not contend evermore concerning man, since he is but flesh. His day shall be 120 years. But then the very last verses, 5, 6, 7, and 8 of last week's Torah portion says, God saw that the wickedness of man was great upon the earth, and that every product of his thoughts of his heart was but evil always. And Hashem reconsidered having made man on earth, and he had heartfelt sadness. And Hashem said, I will blot out man whom I created from the face of the earth, from man to animal to creeping things, and to birds of the sky, for I have reconsidered my having made them. God says, I'm going to destroy the world I created. The very last verse says, but Noah found favor, grace in the eyes of Hashem. It's interesting that the word Noach, if it's spelled backwards, it's the word chen, which means favor and grace. So Noach is the one person who finds favor and grace in the eyes of God, and that's the introduction to this week's Torah portion, where God tells Noach to build the ark, and he floods the world and saves Noach and his family and everything else that occurs in this week's Torah portion. But before we even get into this week's Torah portion, I have to point out something which is quite fascinating, and that is that if you look at the 4 words, and you have to appreciate Hebrew a little bit, but I'll walk you through this slowly. When Noach is born, his father says, Zeh yenachamenu mimasenu umiitzvon yadenu. This son will comfort us from our handiwork and from the toil of our hands, from our work and the toil of our hands. If you look at these 3 words, you find that when God regrets making the world, it says vayinachem. Now, yinachem can mean comfort or have a change of heart. And they're actually not opposites, because when a person is grieving and you comfort them, you give them a different perspective of how to see what happened, and you give them comfort, you're causing them to have somewhat of a change of heart. So the same word that Lemach uses to describe his son's name, he will bring us comfort, is now used to say God had a change of heart. Vayinachem Hashem. Ki asa, that he made, the same as the word mima asenu, our actions. And finally, the 3rd word, that vayisatsev elibo, God was sad in his heart, metaphorically, just like the same word that Lemach said, umeyetzvel yadenu, the toil, the sadness of our hands' work, that we have to work the earth. How is it that the same words are used right here to describe God's plan to destroy the world? And a beautiful thought is that, sometimes, and we all do this, we feel a void in our lives. We feel a emptiness. We feel some kind of a calling, a yearning, a striving, and we want to satisfy ourselves. We want to fulfill this craving, this urge, this desire. But sadly, instead of realizing that the way to fill it is through healthy, wholesome, loving interactions with people, kindness, Torah study, prayer, mitzvot, we try to fill it with other material things, thinking that that's going to bring us contentment and satisfaction, only to be disappointed later and to realize that it doesn't ever bring us satisfaction, because that's not what we were craving in the first place. The worst example of this is drug addiction, obviously. When a person is addicted to drugs, their mind knows that they're destroying their body, but they just need they're in such pain that they need a relief. I remember once talking to a drug addict who used heroin, and I said, why do you do this? So he says, when I take the heroin, he says, I feel like the world is hugging me and embracing me. Sadly, this person grew up without hugs, without love, and is craving that feeling of being loved. And the heroin gives him that feeling that the world is embracing him. So all of our cravings and all of our yearnings, the underlying desire is a spiritual desire. It's a need for love, for recognition, for validity, for validation, for a sense of meaning and purpose. But sadly, it's a lot quicker to have a drink or to have something else, or some other physical distraction or pleasure that takes our mind off what's really that our soul is crying out for and seeking. So, to tell you a little story as a parable, they tell a story about a princess who fell in love. Love is blind. She fell in love with a farmer, a simple farmer. And, the king said to his daughter, yeah, you're going to leave the palace. So you have so much beauty and luxury and culture and art and sophistication and education. You're just going to go live on a farm. And she said, yeah, I love him. I love him. I love him. But then she went to live on the farm with a simple farmer. But then the farmer saw that his wife is a little depressed. She's not so happy. So he says, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to go out and pick the best potatoes and give it to her. He brings her a gift of the best potatoes he can find on the farm. And once again, she's still depressed. He says, let me try the best carrots. And he brings that. She's still depressed a week later. Let me give her the best squash I can find. Finally, he says to her, what's the matter? I brought you the best potatoes, the best carrots, the best squash. And she said to her husband, I love you, but unfortunately, you don't even understand what it is that I'm yearning for, that I'm lacking, that I'm missing. Because you never lived in the palace. You don't understand the life of royalty. And the same thing is with the body and the soul. The soul leaves the palace, the heavenly palace, to come down to this world and live in a physical body. And the soul is unhappy with this marriage because the soul craves the spiritual, lofty connection to God that it has in heaven before its soul came down into this world. And the body says, you're unhappy. Why are you so depressed? Why are you so downtrodden? You know what? Let me take you to a nice restaurant. And then we're happy for a few minutes and then we're depressed again. Oh, let me take you to a nice show. Let me take you to the theater. Let me take you on a vacation. I'll get you a new car or something. We keep on trying to lift our spirits. And the soul, like the princess is saying, is unfortunately what you're giving me is very nice and you're trying really hard, body. But what I'm lacking, what I'm yearning for, you don't even understand because you never lived in that spiritual realm. Thank God we do know what the soul wants because the Torah tells us what the soul wants. What the soul wants is mitzvahs and Torah and good deeds. And that's why the truth of the matter is we know that when we have physical pleasure, we're happy for a moment, but afterwards it's fleeting. But as opposed to spiritual fulfillment, even though it may take more effort to achieve it, it's not like physical pleasure, which comes quickly and easily. I could walk into a restaurant right now and for $20, I could have a great meal and feel good for 30 minutes. But how am I going to feel afterwards? But spiritual achievements take time and effort. And kindness and goodness takes investment of energy and resources, but the return is so much deeper and more everlasting. Every time you think about the good deed you did, it gives you dividends, so to speak. So we try to fulfill ourselves with the wrong things. And this is explanation of what happened. Why was Lamech looking for relief? He says, because from the earth that God cursed. What does that mean, from the earth that God cursed? Because unfortunately, man's ways had become corrupt. As we see, God planned the flood because man's ways were so corrupt. But instead of looking for the proper relief and comfort by changing their ways and increasing in positivity and goodness and righteousness and adherence to God's will, he said, let's invent a plow. Let's find a way to make our lives more comfortable, more luxurious, more laid back, less toil. And therefore, God uses those same words to say, I regret making man, because they saw the corruptness of their ways, but instead of seeking a return to a proper path, they sought other ways to dull their senses and comfort themselves from their sadness, which was really stemming from the fact that the earth was cursed because of the ways of man at the time. With this introduction, we're ready to begin the actual Torah portion of Noach. And Noach is a very complex fellow. Noach, as we know, right in the opening verse, the Torah tells us he was a tzaddik. Now, and today, if you say someone's a tzaddik, it's a tzaddik, what could be better than that? He's a righteous person. Not only was he a tzaddik, the Torah says, ish tzaddik tamim haya, which means he was perfect. The Torah doesn't just say he was righteous, he was perfectly righteous. So on the one hand, in Judaism, there's the one hand, and the other hand, there's always more than one hand. On the one hand, he was a perfectly righteous man. On the other hand, there are Jewish boys who are named Noah. So it is a Jewish name, and we do name our kids sometimes after him, not just Avraham and Moshe and Yitzchak and Yaakov, for the boys, that is, for the girls, it's Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah, and so on and so forth. Noach is a Jewish name because he was a perfectly righteous man. But having said that, we know that Noach is not the first Jew. He's not the beginning of our ancestry. He is not part of the Jewish family. He is not the patriarch of our nation. It's only at the end of this week's Torah portion that we'll be introduced to the next individual, which is 10 generations later, Abraham, who becomes the first Jew, and his wife Sarah, the first Jewess and first patriarch and matriarch. So the question is, if he was perfectly righteous, why is he not considered the first Jew? And the answer, of course, is that Noah had one major failing. His virtue was that he lived in a society that was completely evil and corrupt. As the Torah says, "V'timalei ha'aretz Hamas." I always find it fascinating that Hamas is a terrorist organization, and the Hebrew word for corruption and evil here in the Torah is Hamas, spelled the same way, Hamas. So Hamas means evil, and you know the story of this guy who was 100 years old, and they said to him, "What's the best part of being 100 years old?" And he said, "The best part of being 100 years old is you have no more peer pressure." So we all know that we're all influenced by our peers, by our surroundings, by our society. Noach was not corruptible. He was uncorruptible. There are certain people, no matter what everyone's doing, they will do the right thing because they don't look at what others are doing. They do the right thing regardless of what everyone else is doing. They're not swayed by those around them, and they just do what is right regardless. So that makes Noach extremely righteous. So what was wrong with Noach? And there's actually a discussion in Rashi. What would have been had Noach lived in the generation of Abraham? Would he been a greater tzaddik or a lesser tzaddik? One opinion says he would have been a lesser tzaddik because, compared to Abraham, he wouldn't be so great. But others say, no, he would be even greater than Abraham because to live in a wicked society and still be righteous is much more difficult than living in a good generation. Had he lived amongst good people, he could have even achieved a greater, higher, more loftier status. But what is the failing of Noah? So if you look in the Haftorah that we're going to read, the Shabbat, which is the Torah of Noah, the prophet Isaiah, when he talks about the flood waters, he refers to it as Mei Noach, the waters of Noah. And the rabbis say that the blame for the flood waters was upon Noah. Why was the blame of the flood waters upon Noah? So rabbis say that he didn't pray for his generation. One of the things when God tells Abraham he's going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham starts to protest. He starts to say, God, you're the judge of the world. How can you not do justice? How could you destroy the wicked with the righteous? They are wicked. There are wicked people, but there are also righteous people in the cities. And he says, what if I find 50 people, 45, 40, 30, 20, 10? He tries to save the people. He prays to God on their behalf. Moses, when the Jews worship the golden calf, does the same thing. He says, God, how could you wipe them out? How could you destroy them? And he gets forgiveness for the Jewish people. He succeeds. Not one word of Noah praying to God, protesting God's plan. God says, Noah, I'm flooding the world. Go build an ark. And Noah says, yes, sir. God, as you say, right? There's not one word of objection. And not one word of prayer on behalf of his generation. So for that, our rabbis say the flood waters are blamed on him by the prophet Isaiah. May Noah, the waters of Noah, because had he prayed for his generation, he perhaps could have saved the generation. And lesson number one is that we should never accept, when God does something to us, sometimes we say, look, God, if this is your will, maybe I'm not deserving of anything better. But we still pray for ourselves. But when it comes to the next person, you can never say, well, maybe they're not deserving of better. Because yourself, you could judge. You could say, well, I'm not so worthy. But the next person, you have to just see the good in them. And therefore, they're surely worthy. And therefore, you have to pray for the well-being of others. And the fact that Noah was a very obedient person. That was his nature, because everyone else was sinning, corrupt, all types of corruption, murder, theft, sexual improprieties. And he always was obedient. He was righteous, but he was too obedient. Why? Because when God told him to build an ark, he was obedient. He built the ark, locked the doors, put his family into it, got all the animals in that God told him to, and let the world go to pot. Let the world drown around him. Sometimes it's not good to be obedient. Sometimes you have to protest or pray and beseech and urge God to change his plans. So that's the first failure of Noah. The second failure of Noah was that when he goes into the ark, it's just him, his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives, 8 human beings. And the question is, wasn't he able to persuade anyone? You know, we're going through an election cycle now, right? And what do we see during an election cycle? Everyone's trying to persuade others, right? Whatever your role is, you try to use your influence to persuade your friends, your neighbors, your community, whoever you could try to influence to vote for the one you think is the better candidate, right? If Noah knew there was a flood coming and God was destroying the world because of corruption, he should have been actively going around and lobbying his friends and his family, community members, and saying, listen, we need to change our ways. God's going to destroy the world. We need to do teshuvah. And had he succeeded in influencing anyone, they would have been saved with him in the ark. The fact that no one else besides his family was saved means that he didn't persuade anyone. Now, there's no recording of him trying to attempt even to persuade anyone. And unlike Abraham, who's going to be the contrast in next week's Torah portion, that we find that Abraham, it says he and Sarah made souls in Haran. The Rebbe said, what does it mean, the souls? That when he went on his journey, Lech Lecha, he took the souls that he made in Haran. How do you take the souls? What are the souls that Abraham and Sarah made? Our Rebbe say the people they converted to Judaism, to believe in one God, to monotheism, to the ways of Abraham and Sarah of loving kindness and righteousness. So Abraham and Sarah were not insular. They were not hermits. They went out and engaged people. And our rabbis talk about it at great length. Abraham and Sarah would invite guests into their home and then engage them in conversation about ideology, about belief, about faith in God, about kindness. Noah doesn't seem to do any of that. And so his first failing is that he doesn't pray to God for God to spare the world. But second of all, he doesn't pray. At least he could have tried to influence some other people and bring them into the ark with him. Because of these 2 moral failures, plus one additional one, he's considered a good man, but not worthy to be the first Jew. What's the third moral failing of Noah? That after the flood is over, we're going to see later in the Torah portion, God tells him to go out of the ark. He leaves the ark. And when he leaves the ark, it says, what does he do? He plants a vineyard. And he gets drunk, and there's a whole story about how his children see him drunk in the tent, and 2 of his children cover him up. And our rabbis say that his third failing was that he became a man of the earth. In the beginning, he's Ish Tzaddik. Later on, he's called Ish Adama, man of the earth. Why? Because when you come out after a flood and you see the whole world is destroyed, your job is to begin rebuilding the world. And the first thing to do is to plant wheat that people can eat and survive for the future of life and civilization. But he escapes. He drinks the wine that he plants the vineyard. He drinks the wine, gets drunk. Now, we may say, look, he was depressed, came out to a world, we're in the generation after the Holocaust. And there's something called survivor's guilt, where survivors, who were lucky enough to survive the Holocaust said, why me? My father, my mother, my brothers, my sisters, my children, in some cases, didn't survive. Why do I get to live? And to rebuild your life after such tragedy is incomprehensible, really. When we look at the generation of survivors, it's really hard to fathom how so many of them were so successful in rebuilding their lives. I mean, we know, God forbid, people go through traumas, people go through tragedies. It's very hard to pick up the pieces and move on with your life. Imagine a survivor who lost, most of their own family, their parents, their siblings, their, God forbid, children, and to have the will and the desire to start again, to start a second family and I speak firsthand from my grandparents who both survived Auschwitz, and my grandfather lost his wife and 3 children and then married my grandmother and built a new family. And you're in awe of how they had the ability to function and to persevere and to believe in life after witnessing so much evil and so much death and so much tragedy. But Noah, literally the whole world was destroyed. And at first he didn't want to even go on, but God promised him he would never bring a flood again, and showed him the rainbow, that, he will never bring the flood on the earth again, and so on and so forth. But having said that, he did not show the characteristics and the traits of being a true survivor, in the sense that he was willing to rebuild the world. And therefore, for all of these 3 things, not praying, not convincing anyone to change their ways, and not rebuilding the world, he's a great man. Like I said, you may know a Jewish child by the name of Noah, or a Jewish man by the name of Noah, but he doesn't go down as a Jew. He's not part of the Jewish family. To tell you the Hasidic interpretation, they say that when they refer to Noah in Hasidic thought as a tzaddik in pelts, which literally means a tzaddik in a fur coat. What does that mean, a tzaddik in a fur coat? When it's cold in a room, there are 2 solutions. One is to put wood in the fireplace and put on a fire. Another solution is to put on a warm fur coat. The difference, obviously, is that when you put wood in the fireplace, everyone in the room is warmed up. When you put on a fur coat, everyone else is cold and you're warm. And there's 2 mentalities that people have. Sometimes when people see a problem, they think, okay, what's a solution that will not only benefit me, but benefit everyone who has the same problem, the same predicament? I'm not just looking out for myself, I'm looking out for everyone in this situation, and design a solution that will be for the benefit of everyone. And others just want to put on a fur coat and make sure that I'm warm, and I'm not worried about it. It's not my problem that other people are suffering. And that was Noah. Noah put on a fur coat. He built an ark for him and his family to be saved and let the whole world be drowned. And that's not the way we're supposed to do it. We're supposed to not be the tzaddik in the fur coat. We're supposed to be the tzaddik who puts the wood in the fireplace and warms up everyone else. But we have to ask ourselves the following question. And the question is, if Noah was a man of such faith in God, such righteousness, and he believed in God and he followed God's ways despite everyone in his society doing the opposite, why didn't he pray for others? Why didn't he convince others? You would expect a man of such faith in God would pray for others and try to convince others. And it's very interesting. The Beis Halevi, or Levi Soloveitchik, says in his book Beis Halevi something very interesting. He says it says that when the rain started coming down, first it came down as rain, then it came down as flood waters. Why? Because God's mercy is so great that even when he's bringing punishment, he waits till the last minute. Maybe when they see the rain, they'll start changing their minds and they'll do teshuvah, and I won't have to destroy them. So he gives us every possible opportunity to correct our ways before it's too late. So our rabbis say that when Noah was told, okay, it's time to get into the ark, Noah didn't go in. He waited, because only when the floods water started coming down strong, that's when he ran into the ark. It's sort of like if on Sukkot, maybe he was sitting in the Sukkot and started drizzling. You're like, it's just drizzling. Everything's going to be okay. And then when the rain starts coming down, everyone grabs their food and runs inside in the last minute. Same thing with Noah. So rabbis say, and Rashi quotes this from the Talmud, that Noah mikatne emunah, he was a man of small faith. And it wasn't enough that God told him there was going to be a flood for him to believe it. He had to actually see the rain coming down. It's sort of like with hurricanes too in Florida, when the forecast tells us some people a week and ahead, they're boarding up, they're packing up, they're out of town way in advance. They trust everything the meteorologist says. Other people's like, let's see, when the wind starts blowing and the rain starts coming, it's time to board up and get out, Noah was like the latter. He didn't get into the ark till the rain started coming down. He was a man of small faith. So rabbis say that, and the Beis Halevi says that it doesn't mean he had small faith in God. He had small faith in himself. You see, when we talk about faith, there's faith in God and then there's faith in yourself. Meaning, when you talk about prayer, right? In order for a person to pray, they have to have faith in God. If you don't believe in God, why would you pray? Obviously, you need faith. But not only do you need faith in God, you need faith in your ability to affect change in heaven on behalf of yourself or others. You have to have, so to speak, confidence in yourself. Same thing with trying to persuade other people. Even till today, I find that there are two types of Jews. There's some types of Jews, they keep their Judaism to themselves. They could have a Jewish coworker, a Jewish friend, a Jewish neighbor. They're not secure enough to talk to their friends about Judaism because they don't have enough confidence in who they are. But then there's another kind of Jew who has a lot of confidence and faith in his faith or her faith and in what they represent. And they're comfortable saying to their neighbors, why don't you come over for Shabbat dinner? And they're not worried that they're secular, they're not going to be interested, they're not going to know what to do, they're going to be turned off, they're not going to know what it is. No, I know they have a Jewish soul and they're going to love Shabbat, they're going to love the Kiddush, they're going to love the prayers, they're going to love the Torah study because they're Jewish. Their neshama is craving this. So some people are confident and they have faith in what they are and who they are, and others don't. Noah didn't have faith in himself. That was the problem. And therefore, he didn't have the ability to convince others. And if you're going to inspire someone else and persuade someone else and convince someone else, you have to first really, truly believe it and have strong faith and trust in what it is you're trying to convince others to do. And that's perhaps some of the psychology of why Noah did not pray for others and did not persuade anyone else, but merely saved himself and his immediate family. So Noah goes ahead and builds this ark. And then he's told to bring animals into the ark. And we know the kosher animals, he brings 7 and 7 pairs. And the non-kosher ones, he brings 2 by 2, right? And what's fascinating, and the Talmud hones in on this, is that when it talks about the non-kosher animals, it doesn't just say unclean, which is the way to describe the animals that are not kosher, but rather it says from the animals that are not clean. See, in Hebrew, there's a word for unclean, tameh. It's the opposite of clean. The Torah could have said from the clean animals bring 7, and from the unclean, which is tameh, one word, tahor tameh, bring 2. Torah doesn't do that. The Torah says, umena behema asher eineno tahora, which is from those animals that are not clean. And the rabbis say, why doesn't it just say the simple word, tameh, which is the word for the opposite of clean? Instead, it says for the animals that are not clean. And the rabbis tell us a very important lesson here, that something we could all apply on one level or another in our daily lives. And that is that a person should always speak b'lashon nekiya, in a clean language. So we know today there's a lot of profanity in the world. People use profanity all the time. I heard a story once that there was a religious girl and she went for a job interview in some company that was whatever it was. I don't know what the company was, but they really liked her. They thought she was very suitable for the job. But before they hired her, the boss says, look, I'm ready to hire you, but I just got to warn you. I guess whatever the business was like a heated type of business, a very stressful environment type of workplace. I don't know what kind of business it was. I just want to warn you, I see you're a very religious girl, very modest, the way you dress, the way you act. A lot of people around here, especially a lot of the men, when things get hot and heavy, maybe it was a stockbroker, I don't know, he says they use profanities, they use curse words all the time on the phone, they're screaming, yelling, and I just want to make sure you're okay with that, because you're going to be around it. And the girl went home and said to her father and mother, what should I do? I want this job, it's a great job, but the guys tell me up front that Be ready to hear words you're not used to hearing. And of course, the parents said, no, don't take the job. You'll find another job. Don't be around that environment. Even if you're not saying those words, your ears shouldn't have to hear all these types of words. But today, a lot of people talk that way. And unfortunately, a lot of the music that our children, I don't know about our children, but that our youth in society listen to, the lyrics, especially the rap songs and all of that, are filled with this kind of language, which is extremely, filthy type of language. But here the Torah shows us to what extent. The word tameh is not a bad word. It's just defining the animal as being unclean, which again is the word tameh. And the Torah says, no, from an animal that's not clean, you should take 2 and 2. So the point is that, there's many levels to this. Surely we should never use profanities or curse words or things like that. But even and I'm sure I've shared this with you before, that, I had the privilege and the honor of being at the Lubavitcher Rebbe's talks for many, many years. The Rebbe passed away a year after I got married, but my whole life I grew up by the Rebbe. And you'll be surprised to know this, that when the Rebbe spoke at the Farbrengens, which he spoke constantly, he wouldn't even use the word death. The word in Hebrew is for death is maves. Maves is death. Chaim is life. The Rebbe could have said maves, which is one word, but he would always say hepach hachaim, the opposite of life. Now, it's a very refined way of talking, a very high level of sensitivity, that he didn't even want to say anything negative. So he would say life, chaim, or hepach hachaim, the opposite of life, without saying the actual word death. And there are many stories, as you know, that the Rebbe, for example, Rabbi Telushkin talks about this in his book, Rebbe, that, and it's a well-known fact, that the Rebbe wanted all the hospitals in Israel to change their name. Because in Israel, hospitals are called Bet Cholim, the house, Bet Cholim, for sick people, house of sick people. And the Rebbe said they should call it Bet Refuah, the house of healing. And the Rebbe said physically, psychologically, if a patient comes to a Bet Cholim and he's thinking, I'm now going into a house of sick people versus I'm going into a house of healing, focus on the positive. Yes, it's a house of sick people, but it's also a house of recovery and healing. So why focus on the negative? Focus on the positive. And you may say it's just semantics. What's the difference what you call it? The Rebbe says, no, words matter and what we say matters and the way we process things. And it's fascinating because in today's day and age, we know this, and the Talmud said this, 2,000 years ago, to use clean language, positive language. But today, we all know in the world of marketing, which is a multi-trillion-dollar business, marketing and messaging, companies hire top-notch marketers and branders to come up with the best messaging to sell the most product in their advertisements. And we don't even realize the extent of thought that goes into the precise wording of every advertisement or every tagline or every, Nike, just do it, or whatever it is. There's a whole psychology behind it that they use to make our brains think in a certain way, to act in a certain way. So we know through science today and through, the world of marketing and messaging that the words we hear and the words we think in really have an effect on our actions. And the right messaging inspires us to do certain things and vice versa. So the same thing is with the language we use. And, Rabbi Telushkin brings other examples, like you could either say I have a deadline or a due date. And it means the same thing. And this is the time I got to hand it in. But deadline is dead, and due date is like giving birth, due date, when it's due. It's again, it's just words, but it's not just words. And here's the source that our rabbis say. We learned this idea of always speaking in a clean language and in a positive language. Now, we mentioned the idea that when Noah came out of the ark, he planted a vineyard and he got drunk. And he was laying naked, drunk and naked in the tent. And he had 3 sons. One son was Cham. Cham went and saw his father naked in the tent. And he came out and told his brothers, you can't believe it, Dad is drunk, laying naked in the tent. And then the Torah says something so beautiful, that the other 2 sons, which was Shem and Yafes, took a cloak, a blanket, and they went into the ark. I'm sorry, not to the ark, into the tent. He was already out of the ark. He was in the tent now. They took the simla, the blanket or the garment, and they put it on their shoulders. They walked into the tent backwards. They covered the nakedness of their father, while their faces were still backwards. The nakedness of their father they did not see. And when Noach wakes up and he finds out what happened, he curses Cham and he blesses Shem and Yafes. Why does he curse Cham? Because, when you see something that is ugly, when you see something that is shameful, when you witness something that is putting a person in a compromised, embarrassing position, what is your reaction? So there's the reaction of Cham. Let's go tell as many people as we can. You know what I saw? You know what I heard? You know what I witnessed? And that's what we call gossip, right? You witness something, you overheard something, you experienced something. What do you do with that? So the wrong choice is what Cham did. He ran and told his brothers, your father's naked and drunk in the tent. Why do you have to go spread the word to your brothers? What did the other 2 brothers do? And I want to point out these 3 things the Torah makes a point of saying. First thing is the Torah says they wanted to cover their father. So the first thing is when you hear that somebody is in a bad situation, an embarrassing, compromised, shameful situation, they're drunk in the tent like this man. First thing is to do is you have to cover their shame. You have to try to fix the situation. You have to try to help them, get them out of that bad situation. So they said, we got to cover up our father. He shouldn't be laking. We don't want our father to wake up naked in the tent. We want him to be covered, his dignity, his honor. On the other hand, they didn't want to look at their father naked. They wanted to respect the dignity of their father and not even have to look at their father in his state of shame and nakedness. So what do? They put the blanket on their shoulders and walking backwards to go cover their father. But here's what the Torah says. They covered up the nakedness of their father. But their faces were always backwards. You see, it's one thing to walk into a room backwards, but now you got to put the blanket down on the person to cover them. You got to turn your body a little bit to try to adjust the blanket. But the Torah says, even as they fixed the blanket, not only didn't they walk in forward to see their father naked, but even when they physically had to cover him, they kept their faces turned. They turned their body. But the whole time they kept their face the other way. They never wanted to even look at their father in that position. And now you understand why when Noach wakes up and he finds out what happened, he blesses them because he realizes how good they were. But then the Torah doesn't even stop there. The Torah says they went in backwards. They covered the nakedness of their father, and their faces were backwards, and the nakedness of their father they did not see. Now here's the most powerful lesson of all. If it already said they went in backwards, and not only that, but even when they covered him, they kept their face backwards. Why does the Torah have to write 4 extra words? The Torah doesn't write any extra words. And the nakedness of their father, they did not see. Of course they didn't see. They don't have eyes behind their head. If they walked them backwards and kept their head, then they didn't see it. Why does the Torah have to even say it? And here we come to a very deep point. And again, these are such powerful lessons that if we could only implement some of them, the world would be so much better. Human nature is something called negativity bias. People like to look for negativity. They like to focus on negativity. We're more inclined to notice something negative than positive. That's why when on a highway, sometimes there's traffic and you're waiting to see what happened. It turns out the accident's on the other side of the highway. But everyone's what they call rubbernecking. They want to see the excitement, the drama, what happened there, We tune into things that are unusual, that are negative, unfortunately. And we have to try to be positive bias, not negative bias. But here's the $1 million question. You saw something. You witnessed something. the brothers had a choice. They heard about their father naked in the tent, so they came up with a plan to walk him backwards. But let's say you walk in on something and you see something that you should not have seen, but wasn't your fault. You like the first brother, he walked in, he sees his father naked in the tent. So in life, sometimes you are privy to certain things for whatever reason. They come your way. Maybe it's your job to be privy to it. You're a psychologist, you're a rabbi, you're a relative, about a situation in the family that's someone's in an embarrassing, did something, or you read something in the news, you turn on your computer and there's a headline about somebody that they did something, God forbid, right? So what do you do with that? What do you do with that? So what the Torah is telling us is as follows. If God showed you something, why did God show it to you? You learn about something. You weren't looking for this information. For whatever reason, it came to your attention. And you have to say, why did this come to my attention? Either that someone called you or whatever it may be. So if God brought it to you, it's because there's something you can do to help the situation. In other words, I'm not here to look at the situation to see the nakedness of the person. Nakedness is a metaphor for the shame of the person, for the compromised position of the other person. I'm here to cover the person up. I'm here to try to give them back their honor and dignity. I have to bring in the blanket and cover them up. But at the same time, I can't look at them. Not look at them physically, because sometimes you have to look at them physically, right? If you're a relative and you have to deal with a situation in the family, you have to unfortunately get involved and you have to learn about all the whatever happened in the situation that caused this problem. You have to get involved. You don't always have the option to not look, to not notice, see. But there's physical looking and emotional looking. There's looking in a way, I need to see what the problem is. It's sort of like when you go to your doctor, right? Physically, right? You say, I have a problem here. He says, okay, let me see what the problem is, right? He's not judging you. He's just trying to diagnose what the problem is, to know what the best remedy is. So he says, okay, please undress. I need to examine. You have to see what the story is. He's not there to look at your nakedness. He's not there to look at your shame or to look at he's just fixing the problem. The same thing is with emotional things. When we look at a situation, it should be in the way of saying, what do I need to know to help this person? I may need to know a lot of information. There's a couple having a marriage problem. I need to talk to the husband. I need to talk to the wife. I need to learn what he did wrong, what she did wrong. But I could look in a way of like, I'm looking at their nakedness. I'm looking at their shame. I'm looking at their vulnerability. I'm looking at their compromised position in life, or whatever the issue may be. It could be with children. It could be in a million other areas of life, business, whatever. Or I could be saying, I'm looking to know what I need to do to help them, but I'm not judging you. I'm not looking down on you. And that's what the Torah says. Not only didn't they see their father physically, surely they didn't, because they walked him backwards, but even emotionally, they didn't see the nakedness of their father. They weren't there to pass judgment. And I'll tell you something amazing. The Baal Shem Tov says something fascinating. He says that every person is a spiegel. Spiegel in Yiddish means a mirror. That if God shows you something in someone else, you have to ask yourself, why did God show that to me? And the Baal Shem Tov says it's a mirror to yourself. God wants to show you something within yourself that you need to improve. So God uses that other person as a mirror for you to see yourself. Now, there's a lot of psychological truth to that too. It's not only a spiritual thing. Sometimes we identify things in other people because we have that. Like we say, oh, this person is so jealous. They may not be jealous at all. But because you think in jealous terms, you assume it's called projection in psychology. We project onto others our own weaknesses and failings. There's a Yiddish expression that says, "Eifen Ganef brennt das Hittel." On the Ganef, the hat is burning. What does that mean to say? The person, something's missing, right? Oh, he must have stolen it. Why are you assuming someone stole it? Maybe it got lost. And then later you find it and you feel so bad, right? I judged this person. I thought he stole it. He didn't really steal it. He was actually honest. But why did you think that way? Because maybe you're the type of person that you would try to cheat somebody like that or steal something from somebody. In other words, what you could relate to And the opposite is true too. If you're the type of person who always sees the good in others, it's because you think that way. You think in a positive way. That's what you would do under those situations. So you assume everyone else is good just because that's what I am like, So if you're a good person, you tend to think others are good. And that's why they say what you say about others really says more about yourself than about them, because it's who are you and what are you projecting onto others. So the Baal Shem Tov says, now it doesn't mean literally. It doesn't mean that if you see someone commit murder, oh, he's a mirror, I'm a murderer. Just because you witnessed murder, God forbid, or theft doesn't mean you're a thief. But in some way, maybe God is sending you a message that in this area, there's something that you could do that you need to know about to learn. And that's the proper mindset. When you see whatever you see a child who's very disrespectful to his parents, and your first impulse is, what a disrespectful child. It doesn't have to be a child, it could be an adult, right? They don't care about their parents. They don't do anything. That's passing judgment on them. So the first thing is, you're not there to judge them. You're there to help them. So how are you going to help them? Most people just judge, but don't do anything. The Torah says the opposite. Try to help them. Like Cham and Yafis, Shem and Yafis covered their father. Like, how could I help them change? And don't judge them. They shouldn't look like they're being judged or feel like they're being judged. But furthermore, maybe there's something I have to learn. Do I treat my parents adequately? Well, doesn't mean I neglect them like this other person, but maybe there's room for me to improve. And Hashem is showing me this so I could become better. And the miracle is that when we look at people in this positive way, it's life transformative for those people and for ourselves. When people know they're not being judged, that someone's really just there to help them, they're much more receptive. A lot of times when we tell people what they did wrong and they reject it, it's because they feel they're being criticized and judged and looked down upon. And if they accept your judgment of them, they're admitting that they're lesser. But if they know you're doing it with no judgment, with no criticism, you're just trying to help them, they're much more likely to want to hear it, because their admittance doesn't make them any less in your eyes. Now, it's a very high level of operating, but this is what we have to strive for. And that's why the Torah tells us these stories. You can imagine there are many stories the Torah doesn't tell us. The Torah chooses select stories because of the lessons that these stories are here to teach us. And I'll just conclude with an amazing story. There was a rabbi, I think he passed away not long ago, unfortunately. His name was Rabbi David Trenk. I think his name was Trenk. He was a principal in a high school in Masifta, and he was an amazing, amazing educator in this religious school. And a true story they told about him after he passed away, I think they wrote a book about him because he was an extraordinary educator, was that there was a kid on Friday night in the yeshiva who decided he was going to, imagine this kid, he was going to break into the principal's office, steal the keys to the principal's car, and drive to the local movie theater to watch a movie on Friday night. And that's pretty extreme in a yeshiva, to steal the principal's keys, drive on Shabbat to a theater, and go watch a movie on Shabbat. Well, another kid saw him. I guess the school wasn't, for the best kids. And this other student saw him and said, I want to go with you. What are you doing? I want to join. He said, no, you can't come with me. He said, if you go without me, I'm going to report you to the principal. Anyways, he didn't take him serious. He left without him. But this kid went and told the principal, this Rabbi David Trenk, I want you to know this kid just stole your car, and he told me he's going to the movie theater to watch a movie. And the movie theater was like 3 miles away. It was a cold winter night in Lakewood, New Jersey. When Rabbi Trenk heard this, he put on his hat and his jacket and his boots, or whatever it was, the weather, and he headed out. And he started walking to the movie theater. He walked the 3 miles. He came to the theater, and he went to the ticket collector, and he said, look, I'm not here to watch the movie. There's just one of my students is in one of the movies. I need to know which one he went to. If you saw this boy, whatever, I need to talk to him. I'll be right in and right out. Somehow he convinced the ticket collector to let him get in. He looked around the different theaters. Finally, he found the one somehow that the student was in. He walked in during the movie. He was very careful to bend down, not to block anyone. And he walked into the rows and sat down right next to the student. The student turns around Friday night. He sees his rabbi on Shabbat in his Shabbat clothing sitting next to him in the movie theater. He couldn't believe it. He was waiting for the rabbi to like really scold him and shower him with rebuke. And the Rabbi Trenk said to this boy, I just want to let you know that I came here because I heard you came here, that you stole my car and you came here to watch the movie on Shabbat. Just wanted to let you know that the popcorn here at the theater is not kosher. So just, I wanted to give you a heads up not to buy the popcorn, okay? And have a good Shabbos. And he got up and started leaving the theater. The student was so overwhelmed that the rabbi didn't scold him, he didn't rebuke him, he didn't even judge him. He just said, I came because I walked 3 miles because I just wanted to let you know the popcorn's not kosher. You know, don't eat the popcorn. That he cared so much about him that he should eat kosher popcorn. He couldn't believe it. And the rabbi said, good Shabbos, I'll see you back in yeshiva later. And he started to leave. And the student said, Rebbe, wait, I'm coming with you. The student followed him out of the theater. The student said he started walking home with him, and he thought on the whole way back, the Rebbe would start telling him how terrible he did. So the Rebbe walked 3 miles with him back, Rabbi Trenk, and he sang Shabbos songs and spoke about the weekly Torah portion. Didn't mention once on the whole walk back for almost an hour what he had done. You can imagine the impact it had on the student. That's the story of Cham and Yafes. They didn't judge, they didn't look negatively at the nakedness of the father. They were just here to help their father, cover him up. And that's the story of Rabbi Trenk. And when we learn to show other people that kind of non-judgmental love and care, and unlike Cham, who runs to tell the whole world what he saw, what he experienced, what he witnessed, because it's sensational and it's gossipy and all of that, do the opposite. Okay, if I learned about a situation, we all unfortunately hear about situations that are painful and sad and difficult. The worst thing to do is go spread it around. That's gossip. That's like the story with the Chafetz Chaim when the guy said, I spoke gossip. How could I atone? He said, go take a pillow or a feather pillow and rip it open on a windy night on a rooftop. And then when he went back, he said, am I forgiven? He says, no, now you got to collect all the feathers and put it back in the pillow. He said, I can't. They're blown all over town. He says, your gossip is spread all over town. You tell one person, they tell the next person. You have no idea how far the gossip could spread. If you saw something, the worst thing to do is repeat it. But then you have to say, why did Hashem show this to me? Why did I learn about this? Why was I told about this? Why has this come my way? Obviously, there's something I could do to help the situation. And then you have to go about helping that person in whatever way you can. But the way to help them is not to see their nakedness, not to focus, not to make the person feel like you're looking at them and judging them and criticizing them. You're just purely there to help them cover themselves up and regain their dignity and their honor. And when you do it with that kind of love and compassion, that's when it's transformative for that person and for everyone involved. And that's the lesson of, and the reason why Noach blesses his 2 children, Shem and Yafes, when he learns about the way they handled the situation. So I wish everyone a beautiful day and a Shavua Tov, and hope to see everyone soon at the next class, God willing. I'll just see if there's any messages in the chat. Yes, thank yous, and my pleasure. And is that why he was given the Noahide Laws? Yes, very important. I'm glad someone brought that up. We know that the Jewish people have 613 commandments, but at the same time, we know that there's the 7 Noahide Laws for all of mankind. And Noah is the progenitor of mankind. In other words, he is, after the flood, Adam and Eve survived only through Noach and his descendants. So we are now post-flood, the descendants of Noach. So God said the Jewish people have their commandments, 613 commandments, and the non-Jewish world, the descendants of Noach, have 7 commandments, and it's called the 7 Noahide Laws, and it's our obligation to teach these Noahide Laws. These are the laws God gave to all of mankind to keep after the sin. And a lot of people, it's funny, sometimes I'll ask somebody, or I'll meet someone who's not Jewish and they'll say, oh, Rabbi, but I keep the 10 Commandments. Well, the 10 Commandments were not given to the world. They were given to the Jewish people. So a non-Jew doesn't have to keep Shabbat, for example, even though it's one in the 10 Commandments. The 7 Noahide Laws, and it happens to be that in the Blue Art Scroll Chumash, not all of them, but many of them, they list what they are. The first one is to believe in one God, not to serve idols. Second one is to bless the name of God, never to blasphemy, the prohibition of blasphemy, of cursing God. The third sin of the 7 Noahide laws, or the third commandment, is not to commit murder. The fourth one is sexual transgressions. The fifth one is theft, which is really all of civil law between man and man, treating other people with honesty, integrity, and justice. The sixth one is courts. I know there's a big confirmation going on now in America for the Supreme Court. The idea that we have courts, judicial systems, where people can bring their complaints and their quarrels and their differences and resolve them in a legal, just manner. That is a moral obligation of every society, to set up court systems. And believe it or not, the seventh one is not to be cruel to animals, which is not to rip off a limb from a living animal and then cook it and eat it, but to always be compassionate towards animals as well. So those are the 7 Noahide laws for all of the descendants of Noah. And if you go on the internet, you'll see that there are actually communities called Noahide Communities, where people, their religion is not Christianity or Islam or Buddhism or this or that. Their religion is Noahides. They call themselves Noahides, because what they do is adhere to these 7 principles of life, because this is what God asks of the world. And it's our job as Jews to educate people who are not Jewish about their 7 Noahide laws and commandments. And that's why the Rebbe was very much in favor of a moment of silence in public schools, because one of those 7 Noahide laws is to believe in God. And children should start their day with a moment to meditate about God and about a higher power and a supreme power, because that is a mitzvah on every human being, to believe in one God. So again, wish everyone a beautiful day and a Shavua Tov. And we just started the month of Cheshvan, so Chodesh Tov to everyone. And we should all try to implement these beautiful lessons that we learned in this week's Torah portion. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Thank you for joining. It's great to see everyone on this new cycle of Torah study. All the best.